I never wanted to move to Salem, Oregon. Sure, it's a quiet town with a haunting history, but the supernatural vibes give me the creeps. Working the graveyard shift at the gas station on the edge of town doesn't help. The lonely nights drag on as I wait for the occasional customer needing gas or a midnight snack. Mostly I just read books beneath the fluorescent lights, trying not to imagine what might be lurking in the shadows. Until she appeared. It was just another slow night when the bell above the door announced a customer. A young woman entered, hidden beneath a dark hooded cloak. Her pale skin seemed to glow against the black fabric. She glided toward the counter with an otherworldly grace. Unease prickled under my skin. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I need some ingredients," she replied, her voice eerily raspy. She slid a piece of paper toward me across the counter. I looked down and felt a chill spread through my veins. Scrawled in red ink was a disturbing list: a vial of blood, a lock of hair, a tooth, a nail, a candle, a match, a pentagram. The woman tilted her head, studying me curiously. Then her expression darkened. "You really don't remember?" She produced another piece of paper, a photo from the security camera dated 2 weeks prior. I recognized the night instantly. The stormy night I ignored her pleas for help. The night whatever she was died right outside these doors. My blood turned to ice in my veins as the memories came flooding back. It was a miserable rainy night. The winds howled and tree branches lashed against the windows. I was grateful no one was crazy enough to come out in this weather, until I saw movement outside, a figure stumbling through the parking lot toward the store. I felt a flicker of concern, but quickly suppressed it. I didn't want to get caught up in someone else's problems. The bell jangled violently as the door burst open. The drenched, frantic woman rushed toward me. "Please, you have to help me," she cried. I instinctively backed away, eyeing her warily. Her strange clothes and frazzled appearance unsettled me. "What's wrong?" I asked cautiously. "There's something out there, it's after me." She glanced fearfully out the window into the blackness. I shifted uncomfortably. This was more than I wanted to deal with tonight. "Maybe you should call the police instead," I suggested, hoping she'd just leave. The woman grabbed my arm, her nails digging in painfully. "You don't understand, it almost killed me. Please, let me just wait here until it's gone." I recoiled, pulling away. "I think you should go now," I said coldly. Didn't she realize I wanted to be left alone? A look of despair crossed her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but was interrupted by a loud bang against the window. She jumped back, terror etched across her face. My irritation grew. I just wanted this crazy lady out of my store so I could pass the night in peace. "You need to leave now," I ordered sternly, coming out from behind the counter. With surprising strength, I ushered the increasingly distraught woman toward the exit. She tried begging and resisting, but I refused to listen. Finally, I shoved her out the door and locked it firmly behind her. Through the glass, I saw her screaming and crying, pounding her fists helplessly. But I just retreated back behind the counter, glad to be rid of the unwelcome disturbance. Moments later, the phone rang. I cautiously answered it, expecting trouble, but it was only the manager calling to check in. By the time our call ended, the woman was gone from view. I decided not to mention the encounter. The next morning, I arrived to find police cars in the lot. Turns out a mutilated body had been found nearby. The victim was unidentified but matched the description of the hysterical woman. I never told anyone about her visit that night. I reasoned that I couldn't have known she was really in danger, and I certainly couldn't have protected her from some vicious killer. Over time, I managed to push the guilt out of my mind, until she returned for retribution. I backed away slowly from the vengeful spirit. "I'm so sorry, please, I didn't know," I stammered uselessly. She glided around the counter, decaying leaves swirling around her feet. "Now you'll find out what happens to those who turn their back on the dead," she uttered in a voice like wind through gravestones. I ran out the doors into the gloomy night, her chilling whispers following me. I jumped in my car and tore out onto the road, racing toward the highway. As I drove, pale shapes darted across the road around me, phantom forms of the woman, haunting me, taunting me. Her face appeared in the shadows, her screams echoed all around. At home, I huddled under blankets with all the lights on, trying to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But then I heard it, scraping on the windows, low, unearthly moans in the darkness. I fled into the night again, not even bothering to pack a bag. I just drove and drove, fleeing the paranormal horrors that I had brought upon myself. I ended up in a busy city thousands of miles from Salem, hoping to lose myself in the crowds. But you can't outrun your past. At night she comes to me, tendrils of fog wrapping around my throat, accusing eyes staring out from the shadows. The dead don't forget those who deny them justice. Maybe one day I'll wake up from this nightmare, but the haunting feels so real. I fear I'm slowly going mad. I escaped that encounter with my life, but not my sanity. Salem awakened an ancient evil that night, and some curses are eternal. The witch fulfilled her vow. My punishment is only beginning. There are fates worse than death for those who deny the dead their due. I never wanted to work the graveyard shift at a gas station, especially not in a tiny rural town where the nearest house is a 10-minute drive away. But jobs are scarce around here, so when Ed's Gas and Goods offered me the overnight manager position, I knew I couldn't turn it down. The town of Windrift only has about 500 people living in it. We're just a blip on the map, a pit stop between larger cities. The gas station sits right off the highway, the only building for miles around. It used to be busier years ago, back before they built the big interstate that rerouted traffic away from this stretch. Now it's just travelers passing through and locals filling up their tanks. Quiet nights are the norm, or at least they used to be. Lately things have been feeling off. It started a few weeks ago. I was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. It was around 3 and hadn't seen a customer for hours. That's normal. By midnight, the place becomes a ghost town. I usually spend the nights reading or watching movies on my phone to stay awake. But this night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made a full lap around the inside of the store, checking each aisle and looking out the windows into the darkness. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on my neck were standing straight up. I shook it off and went back to the counter. Must be my imagination playing tricks on me. The next few hours went by without incident. As the sky began to lighten before dawn, I started preparing for the morning manager to arrive. That's when I heard the crunching of tires on gravel outside. I looked up expecting to see headlights pulling up to the pumps, but there was nothing. Just an empty parking lot and the faint glow of the highway in the distance. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving hollow silence in its wake. Uneasy, I finished closing up the register and gathered my things to go home. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the shadows. The next night my paranoia grew. I kept catching movement outside the corners of my eyes. Shadows passing by the windows, dark shapes lurking near the edges of the lot. Whenever I whipped my head around to look, there was nothing there. It was like the darkness itself was shifting and staring back at me. I called Ed around 2 and asked if the security cameras were working. He said as far as he knew they were. But when I checked the screens behind the counter, they showed nothing but pitch-black night surrounding the station. If someone or something was out there, the ancient cameras hadn't picked it up. The wind kicked up as the night went on, giving me a real sense of dread. I locked the doors hours before my shift ended. I know it sounds crazy, but I could almost make out whispered words beneath the howling gusts. Not just the whine of the wind, but voices, hushed and indistinct, but closing in. When 7 finally came, I bolted from the station, leaving the morning manager to unlock. I didn't mention the voices. Didn't want him to think I was losing it. Working alone at night must just be getting under my skin. But driving off as the sun rose, I could have sworn I saw figures lined up along the tree line watching me. Still as statues, except for one that raised an arm in what almost seemed like a wave goodbye. I really considered calling out of my next overnight shift after that. I just couldn't stand another 8 hours of paranoia in that creepy rural outpost. But I knew I had to suck it up. Jobs don't grow on trees around here, and I needed this one. So I choked back my fear and headed in for another long night. I brought a baseball bat with me for peace of mind. If anything freaky happened, at least I had something solid to grip onto. Of course, the night was quiet. No voices on the wind, no shapes darting in the dark. By 3, I'd almost convinced myself the past nights were all in my head. I tried to relax and read my book, with the bat within reach just in case. It was almost 4 when the power cut out. One moment I was reading by the fluorescent lights overhead, and the next plunged into total darkness. Must be a blown transformer, I thought. Called up Ed and let him know what happened. He said he'd send someone down to check it out when the sun came up. In the meantime, I just had to sit tight. I wanted to keep the doors locked like I had last time, but with the power out, people might need gas or supplies. So I found a flashlight and got ready for a long couple of hours in the dark. That's when the scratching started. It was so faint at first that I thought it was tree branches blown against the building. But it seemed to come from all sides, getting louder and more insistent by the minute. Scratch, scratch, scratch on the metal walls outside. I swept my flashlight toward the windows but could see nothing beyond my own terrified reflection staring back. The scratching built to a fever pitch like an animal frantically trying to dig its way inside. But it wasn't localized in one area. It was everywhere, surrounding me. Inside, too. I whipped my flashlight towards the shelves and ceiling tiles, but saw no creatures lurking within. Only heard the unrelenting scratch of claws in the dark, coming closer. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. As soon as the faintest glow peered over the horizon, the scratching stopped. I didn't hesitate to get the hell out of there. Told Ed I wouldn't be back until they had an electrician check every inch of that cursed place. I didn't mention the other bizarre things I'd experienced recently. Didn't want to be accused of losing my mind. But I know what I heard and felt. Something sinister lurks in that isolated station after midnight. And I won't be going back there until the lights are on and the bloody scratching stops. I work at a gas station in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It's a small city on the shore of Lake Michigan, about an hour away from either Chicago or Milwaukee. It's not a bad place to live, but it can get pretty boring sometimes, especially at night, when there's not much to do except watch TV or browse the internet. I usually work the night shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It's not a very busy shift since most people are asleep or at home. Sometimes I get a few customers who need gas or snacks, but mostly I just sit behind the counter and wait for the time to pass. One night I was working as usual when I noticed a car pull up to the pump. It was an old, rusty sedan with a lot of dents and scratches. The driver got out and walked towards the store. He was a tall, skinny man with long, greasy hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a dirty leather jacket and jeans and had a backpack slung over his shoulder. He came into the store and looked around. He seemed nervous and twitchy, like he was on drugs or something. He walked up to me and asked for a pack of cigarettes. "Sure thing," I said, grabbing a pack from behind the counter. "That'll be $6.50. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of bills. He handed me a 10 and said, "Keep the change." "Thanks," I said, putting the money in the register. "Have a good night." He nodded and took the cigarettes. He opened the pack and lit one up right there in the store. I was about to tell him that he couldn't smoke inside, but before I could say anything, he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" Sure," wondering what he wanted. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I blinked. That was not what I expected him to ask. "Ghosts?" I repeated. "Yeah, you know, spirits of the dead. Do you believe in them?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I'm open-minded about it. Why do you ask?" He took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Because I've seen them." "You've seen ghosts?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. He nodded. "Yeah, lots of them, everywhere I go." "Really? Where do you see them?" He looked around the store as if he was searching for something. "Here," he said, pointing at a corner near the fridge. "There's one right there." I followed his finger and saw nothing but empty space. "Where?" I asked. "Right there," he said again more insistently. "Don't you see him? He's standing right there." I squinted my eyes and tried to see what he was seeing, but I still saw nothing. "Who is he?" I asked. "He's an old man. He used to work here. He died here." "He died here?" I repeated. He nodded. "Yeah, he had a heart attack or something. He fell down and hit his head on the floor. He bled out right there." He pointed at a spot on the floor near the fridge. I looked at the spot and felt a surge of fear. There was no blood stain or anything, but somehow, I knew he was telling the truth. "How do you know that?" He shrugged. I just do. The ghosts tell me things. The ghosts tell you things? He nodded again. Yeah, they talk to me all the time. They tell me their stories, their secrets, their regrets. What do they want from you? I asked. He shook his head. Nothing much. They just want someone to listen to them. Someone who can see them and hear them. He took another drag from his cigarette and looked at me with a strange smile. Someone like me, he said. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This guy was crazy or high or both. He was seeing things that weren't there and hearing voices that didn't exist. I decided to end this conversation as soon as possible and get him out of the store. That's very interesting, I said, forcing a smile. But you know what? You really shouldn't smoke in here. It's against the law. He frowned and looked at his cigarette. Oh, he said. Sorry about that. He flicked the cigarette on the floor and stomped it out with his foot. I'll be going now. He grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. Have a good night, I said weakly. He stopped at the door and turned to look at me. You too, he said. And don't worry about the ghosts. They won't hurt you. They're just lonely. He opened the door and walked out. I watched him get into his car and drive away. I breathed a sigh of relief and tried to calm myself down. That was the weirdest and creepiest customer I ever had. I hoped I would never see him again. But I was wrong. He came back the next night, and the night after that, and every night after that. He always asked for the same thing, a pack of cigarettes and a conversation about ghosts. Always told me the same stories. About the old man who died here. About the woman who killed herself in the bathroom. About the child who was run over by a truck outside. He always pointed at the same spots. Where they died, where they bled, where they haunted. Always said the same thing. That he could see them, that he could hear them, that he could talk to them. He always smiled that same smile. That creepy, twisted smile that made my skin crawl. He became my regular customer. My only customer. My nightmare.